Hello everybody. This will be the fourth lecture in the series of the Grace Machine. It's the third lecture on one of the five figures. We started with standing, then jumping, now hanging, and later we'll be discussing the floating and the falling figures. Again, we're dividing this lecture up in two parts, one on ornament and the other on automata. And ornament and automata play a massive role, a really central role, both in the figure of Hephaestus in Greek. Hephaestus being the husband of Aglaia, who we have been discussing more often, especially at the beginning when we talked about the gift cycle and the grace machine as a structure of generosity and shining. She's of course the shining figure. She's the central figure of the gift cycle. The others are Ephrosyne, the receiving figure, and the others the returning figure, Thalia. Three figures that make up the three graces. Hephaestus is her husband. That's awkward, and we'll see why that's awkward. It's a bad marriage. Not very successful. She's been cheating on him very often, especially with Ares, the god of war. But why are they married? Well, it's very simple, because when she's the figure who is shining, he is the figure who makes the shining things. He's a smith god, and there's in many mythologies we got different smith gods. They're not always gods, but Hephaestus is. And so promoted, especially coming from the Bronze Age. You know, the whole idea of metallurgy and forging became so incredibly important that there's this magic of the forge, and we'll get into this notion of magic and what happens in the forge in the cave. But that's basically the structure. That's we have Aglaia, the figure of shining, and we have Hephaestus, the figure of who makes the shining things. We divided it up in two parts, one on ornament and the other on automata. It's a bit, of course, ornament, but Hephaestus is not your typical ornament. It's extreme, and we'll see that there's not just a sort of a light form of ornament with here and there a curl. It is really a sort of extreme overworking and embellishment, and the Greeks being obsessed with appearances. Everything appears in this whole Greek realm. There's nothing that's hidden. Everything appears, and in all the descriptions of battles and gods bathing and anointing themselves, it's always about shining locks of hair and gold and tassel and tresses, and so there's always these descriptions of embellishment. And the most beautiful ones, the ones that are made for the gods, are made by Hephaestus, and it's not just that; it's also automatons or automata. Self-moving tripods, golden robots in the form of maidens, silver dogs, golden thrones. There's a whole range of speaking statues, which is a tradition in Greek culture. But with Hephaestus again, it's on a very extreme and almost hallucinatory quality. So today we'll be talking about ornament, and I've talked a lot about ornament, and I've written a lot about ornament, and not in the usual way. The last time was in the matter of ornament, the second chapter from the sympathy of things, which was in a bit of a different way. I think that book was directed to art historians and especially architects. And this discussion is based on grace and gravity, where the discussion is much more fundamental. The argument is far more fundamental. So it's really about this idea of stance and appearance. So the appearance becoming, or the stance becoming an appearance, or the stance turning into, because the figure is of course that of tropos. Tropos is the figure. It's the central figure in rhetoric. It's a turning. So it's always two things. Though it's one move, it's two things, or it has two poles, which of course we discussed very often, the structure-ornament relationship, or the substance accident, or the ergon parergon, or work and play. But in the sympathy of things, I discussed it in a slightly different way. Was much more a question, not so much about stance and appearance, but much more about how does the wall appear as a whole, as a screen almost. And so I discussed the philosophers of, you call them philosophers of ornament, of the 19th century, John Ruskin and Gottfried Semper. And both were advocating this notion of the wall appearing and radiating. Semper through his notion of both through a notion of textile effect. With Semper, of course, the most important of the four materials of architecture, the four elements of architecture, the textile, the most important one. Creating the structure of the wall, transferred into ornament via carving. We'll be discussing this a bit, but he called it the Gewand, or the Wandgewand. There was the issue of course, in German, the word for wall is Mauer, which is a solid wall, and it's also Wand, which is much more a hollow wall, but Wand relates to Gewand. Semper famously discusses this pretty often, and it's really the main material of the four, and it is the transformation of the wall into a dress. It's not just a dressing of a wall that already exists. Sure, you're hanging your carpets in the medieval times, and it was very important for Semper, but it's really about this transformation, the Stoffwechselthese, as he calls it, this transformation of material. So the Gewand, and for John Ruskin it was the wall veil, this idea of the wall being a veil. So there's both these theoreticians, or the philosophers of ornament, talked about a used textile as an understanding of how this transformation could work, or this idea of radiation. For us, it's more fundamental in the sense that there's these pairs from ergon, parergon, and substance and accident, and work and play, and often grace is sort of understood as being on one side, on the side of parergon, on the side that's ornament, on the side of play, on the side of the appearance or lightness. And that's only partially true, because it as I explained like a few times already, it's far more a loop. It's not like gravity there and grace over there. It's really grace itself that tries to involve gravity, and parergon tries to involve ergon, and play tries to involve work. Of course, we talked about serious play, and we talked about work being playful, or else you cannot work. And that's on a fundamental level. That's really on a fundamental level in the sense of stance transforming into appearance, which we discussed in our little talk in the standing figure on realism. It's really like, yes, of course we have this standing figure. There's the horse, but just standing by itself, Selbstständigkeit, according to Heidegger. Is not just the expression of mind independence, because it might be mind independent, but then is it independent of all mind? If so, it cannot explain how it appears, because then all appearances will be in our minds, and then you have a philosophical problem that's impossible to solve, because then you get a nominal side and a phenomenal side. And that means that realism is not capable of understanding how things appear. So we need a realism that involves that notion of appearing. And then we of course, in the standing lecture, we illustrated that with the standing figure and the hanging orangutan, the figure that is dependent, that literally depends and hangs. But here that hanging is a sign of ornament, because all ornament hangs. Well, a lot of ornament hangs. Pendants, of course, because they've been hanging, tresses, hair, tendrils, tassels, earrings, bracelets, garlands. There's a whole list of ornaments that you can say, yes, they're in this position of hanging. But does that actually mean that ornament hangs? From a physical point of view, obviously. From a physical point of view, it is attached. We'll get to Alberti, who talks about ornament as attached. But does that actually mean that with that word you describe what an ornament is doing and how it is made? Well, probably not. But let's discuss this from that point of view. Let's discuss it from that separation between standing and hanging and ergon and parergon, or work and Beiwerk. That would be the translation. Of course, it's a German translation. Werk und Beiwerk, parergon. We know that from Kant, from the third critique. Let's go to Winkelmann. So here we get a very classic, what is it, 1760s remarks on architecture. It's very difficult to read, but das Wesentliche der Baukunst. That's the first part of the book. So das Wesentliche, that's the material, that's the stone, how you build, the shape of the building, the columns. So that will play a huge role in our discussion as well, because they're sort of the model of standing. And then the second part is die Zierlichkeit. Die Zierlichkeit, that's over here. Die Zierlichkeit. So, Zierlichkeit, how do you translate that? Well, it's about embellishment, decoration, but it also means gracefulness. So again, we get this separation between the essential, das Wesentliche, which is structure, according to Winkelmann, right? According to Winkelmann. And then that what is added on, which is that what is adorned, or that what is embellishment, as sort of something extra. So let's look at how that is structured, that idea. Of course, we discussed this with the birth of Venus and how she stands. Her weakness actually being part of how she stands, but there's we have to follow let's say the figures and the theoreticians from coming from the other direction. In this case, Alberti's the 10 books of architecture, of course, modeled according to Vitruvius. And he says here, this is the translation of Rickert, Joseph Rickert and Neil Leach, has the character of something attached or additional. So that's the description of ornament. There's a very classic description. So we have structure, we have order, and then ornament is added on, right? So structure is abstract, it's geometric, and then to make it lively, you need to quote. It's a mimetic act, so in that sense the apiary is correct. You need to quote from nature. So you get the little cherubs, you get the acanthus leaves, you get all the apples and the fruits and the garlands, and these are added on. So there's a double world. One is an internal structure, the other is a mimetic world of addition. So that's almost like you're gluing the two notions together. But there's another Alberti from an earlier book, the book on painting, and that's quoted by A.B. Warburg. A.B. Warburg famously in his thesis, 1893, who's quoting Alberti from 1555. It is pleasing to see some movement in hair, locks, bows, leafy fronds, and garments. And this goes on and on. This is the description of how a painter should deal with ornament. And of course, that was read by Botticelli. This is interesting because now this is not just a notion of imitation that is added on. It is now a thing that yes, it is added, but it is in movement. It is in movement, and this is very essential to A.B. Warburg. Let me see. On the other hand, however, Alberti expresses interest depicting such motives. The painter keeps a knowledgeable wits about him sufficiently to avoid being tempted to unnatural. Blah blah blah. Yeah, here it comes. Where the wind really might have caused such motion, accessory forms in motion. So, and that he sets his accessory forms in motion. In German, this actually uses the term Beiwerk, accessory form Beiwerk, in motion, bewegtes. So that's the famous construct of A.B. Warburg, bewegtes Beiwerk. Now, in essence, this follows the same structure of something that does not move, ergon, that is in stance, it is standing, and in repose. And then something is added, Beiwerk, that is now moving. And I find that really interesting, though first of all, I don't agree. I've made that clear in the second part of the standing lecture. I think it's wrong to understand these movements as added. Yes, Zephyr on the left is blowing the wind on her hair, and it is like moving. And she as a whole is moving. But look at how she's standing. Everything is moved, right? Her knees are moving, her arms are moving, even her fingers and her neck. Everything's moving. She's in contrapposto, right? So that movement is not external, it's actually internal. Now you can actually say, well, Lars, yes, that explains how she stands, but this hair is still external movement. Yes, that is true, but don't forget this is a painting, and it's not a representation. That would be a representational argument. You would be saying, well, she's standing, it's a painting of somebody who's standing. Well, she's hardly standing. And a painting of hair that is blowing in the wind. But that doesn't explain the figure as a whole. The figure as a whole is something that actually combines this internal movement with an external movement. It's movement everywhere. Why would you place the hair on a different level than the fingers and the knee and the heel? And it's all constructed by movement, and this figure becomes a standing figure. So that would be not a representational analysis, but a figurational analysis. You're looking at the painting as is, right? Not at what it would depict, as if there's a reality behind the painting. No, the painting itself is real, so you have to look at how the figure is constructed, and the figure is constructed by movement. Now, this is extremely interesting because now we are not looking at a figure that has been attached to something, but as something that is a shining figure, but also a moving figure or a figure in movement. So we got some kind of connection here between shining and movement, or between, well, of course, in Hephaestus, a world of ornament and a world of automata, because that would be the first link, so to speak, between, let's say, the level of appearing, right? How do things appear in the world of Aglaia and Hephaestus through ornament, but how do they also move? And that becomes this whole idea of self-movement and automata. So there's this idea of the internal movement spilling over and becoming an external movement. Now, there are more theories of that type of ornament, and one of them is from Georg Simmel, the sociologist. I think this is a text from the 1920s. I'm not totally sure, but it is about adornment, and he's looking at ornament from the point of view of a sociologist, at human behavior. But this is something that Baudelaire already did, huh? In in the 1830s and 40s, when he discussed what was it, the Éloge du maquillage, a text about makeup, women and makeup, and how that would actually intensify the face and make it artificial and make it radiate. And these are the words that Simmel is actually using. Adornment intensifies or enlarges the impression of the personality by operating as a sort of radiation emanating from it. So an outward movement. So here we get to this notion of shining as something that comes out of a thing or is the thing. It's very difficult to say. And I get these very strange, one may speak of a human radioactivity in the sense that every individual is surrounded by a larger or smaller sphere of its significance radiating from him or her. Human radioactivity. So this is an extreme form of radiation becoming radioactivity. But what's really interesting is this term sphere, a radiating sphere. So the word, of course, radiance and radial are linked. And radial means a circle or sphere. And so we now get an understanding of, and this is strongly connected to the figures of movement. Because Simmel is especially interested in not just makeup, but in jewelry and gems and pendants. And what happens with these moving figures is that you get an extra flickering or you get an extra movement. This is what you can know from earrings, obviously, but also from faceted jewels or bracelets that are hanging in rings over an arm. Is that every time the figure moves, the person moves, you get either the tinkling or the flickering or that an extra movement of like earrings, and that is that sphere. That is that sphere. So we got a sphere that is a strong connection between action or movement and shining. It's like this. It's like a ring on your hand. Creates a sphere, right? So of course you would move your hand, you would get the flickering, but if you don't move your hand, there's still this shining that almost like creates a zone of movement, which is this sphere. We know this word sphere also from Walter Benjamin when he starts inventing the aura in sessions of experiencing hashish, and he's talking about ornament and this connection between psychotropic drugs and ornament has been made more often also by Henri Michaud. He talks about mescaline as a form of ornamentogenesis, and with Walter Benjamin it's the ornamentale Umzirkung of things, the aura of things. The aura of things is the ornamentale Umzirkung. So again, Umzirkung is this radial notion of a thing as I would say a blur, as a je ne sais quoi, but something that's glowing, not a je ne sais quoi that withdraws, but one that appears, but not appears as an image, but as an opacity, as an opaque, well, I would almost call a nebula, but there's this very strong idea of a sphere and a radiance. I think it's a beautiful text of Georg Simmel. I want to discuss Zemper a bit because he is really one of our best theoreticians of architecture, especially of ornament. And he also makes these discussions of clothing, obviously, because he's interested in the Gewand and the dress, and dressing, and the dressing of walls, and he does discuss the pendant quite seriously, and of course with textile there's this reversal. Textile is important for Semper because it means two things. One is the use of textile and the use of ornament and textile in ceremonies. Let's say the hanging of garlands, but also the wearing of dresses and special costumes. That is transferred into stone as a transformation, almost from, let's say, the world of ceremonies and rituals and costumes and theater. Talks about this quite a lot, to the monumental art of architecture. So there's somehow architecture is capable of grasping the temporary event of a ceremony and then extending it into public space. I think especially in public space because of course these rituals are public. And they need to be presented in a specific time, or in a cycle of events, and then an architecture is capable of monumentalizing this notion of time. That's one transfer. The other transfer is that textile itself has structure. We see that in this here braiding and knot work. It looks a lot at weaving as well. The weaving of wicker work, especially how that's imprinted into stone architecture. So that's a double transformation of the world of ceremony into the monumental, and the world of the soft textile into the hard structure. But it is not just like an image of textile, but it's really a transformation of textile patterns into the patterns of the structuring of walls. So we got like two figures here that are already thinking differently than Alberti and Winkelmann about ornament. They're thinking much more structurally about it, but also in the sense of what it actually does to the standing elements of architecture, and makes them radiate, but also how that creates a sphere of appearance. Now we're getting to Hephaestus or Hephaestus. This is the book, the 14th book from the Iliad, where Hephaestus is introduced. And you can sort of see a bit from this quote on the left. We're not going to the Greek yet. On the left, this is what is going on with this Greek realm is really quite stunning. And reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, you get always this impression there's nothing hidden. This like in our world, especially since the 19th century, with the invention of the unconscious, there's so much hidden. And all notions of truth are about what is hidden, the structure behind what we see. And with the Greeks, everything's there, and the gods are there. And every time Odysseus needs to take a decision, some kind of god comes and makes an appearance, often through metamorphosis. Of course, through metamorphosis, because how would you meet a god? And again, an appearance. So there's this world of appearing and transformations of appearances, and there's always glittering and gleaming and glowing going on, and it's really quite stunningly beautiful. And of course, beauty is the whole idea. Let me see. This is like, what do we have here? The wondrous robe, embroidered, golden clasps, locks, tassels, ambrosia, cunningly fastened. Oh, this word cunning, we'll get to that. And then this is about Hera, the goddess, the wife of Zeus, and she's girded herself with a girdle that has 100 tassels. Then she fastened her earrings, 3 brilliant pendants with much charm radiating from them. That's like Simmel himself talking. This is a translation by Samuel Butler. But this is quite essential. This describes exactly what we're just discussing. So she's wearing these earrings, and there's much charm radiating from them, and this charm is charis. That's over here. That's grace or charm or whatever. And these cunning things, these beautiful things, are Daedala. That's the word over here, the Daedala. And Cosmon. And these are Hephaestus. So these are the 3 words I would like to take out here. Is Daedala. That's Daedala is a very complex word, and of course we know Daedalus or Daedalus, but it's actually much more an adjective or substantive or a verb even. In many different forms. You find it in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Daedalon, Daedaleos, Daedaleon, Daedalo, many different forms, and it often means yes, decoration and embellishment also, but and elaborate, especially elaborate, but mostly cunning. So we get this idea of appearances being cunning, and that's quite typical. There's again this idea of ornament and automaton, or a world of workings, workings of mechane, as well as a world of appearing, which are always like changing positions, and there's not one behind the other. There's always like these are like coexisting, and we know that for of course cosmon relates to cosmos, which is the whole universe. I mean, generally translated with order, but it's also the root of the word cosmetic. I remember Kumaraswamy writing about this, but it's very extensive. I think von Humboldt actually writes about it in his introduction to his book Cosmos, in the 19th century book, and that's how he sees the whole universe, as this order that appears through ornament. So again, not 2 worlds, but 1 world. And of course, this is the most interesting word, charis, of the 3. What is it exactly? These 3 billion pendants that are then moving with that charm. So bewegtes Beiwerk. We got this idea of a sphere being created by both glitter as well as movement. So let's keep that in mind. Now this is another book of the Iliad. This is the 18th book. This is very famous because there's multiple descriptions of Hephaestus. We'll get to this. We will use the exact same page when we discuss automatons, because this paragraph actually describes how Hephaestus, the club-footed, the lame god. He's always called the lame god, or the one with 2 lame feet, amphigues, is actually like walking, waddling through his forge with the help of 2 golden maidens, 2 golden girly robots that do all this work for him. We shouldn't discuss this now, but this is the famous discussion of Hephaestus being disabled and having to, of course there are 2 because both his legs are disabled, So that's a very prosthetic notion, but again, they're made of gold. So let's go over here, and this is, I'm only showing the start. He gets the question if he wants to actually create the shield of Achilles, and I think this is extremely important because, of course, we can go through the whole shield of Achilles, but that's not so important. What is important that it takes 130 lines, 130 lines in the Iliad to only describe the artwork on the shield of Achilles. And there you see on the right one of the attempts of I think an 18th century artist to recreate. There's many drawings and diagrams and recreations of the shield of Achilles. That's not so important. I think it's what I think is important, that it takes 130 lines. So we're having a shield. Now think of this. Think of this. How our soldiers fight battles, right? So they're in camouflage, and their guns are black, their rifles are black, and so it's all about not appearing, and extremely utilitarian in the sense that you have to be able to take a gun apart in a few seconds and put it back again in the same few seconds. And this is, of course, it's for Achilles, right? So a figure so close to the gods, and who gets help in the Iliad from the gods, but also is like opposed by certain gods. But he gets this shield from Hephaestus, and it's so ornamental that this goes against all our notions of military wear, and it seems overworked, to put it mildly. And this overworking is in English, of course, elaboration, and that contains a very specific notion of work. Elaboration has the word labor in it. And it is like from egg or eggs. It's an overworking, and I think that explains extremely well how Hephaestus sees ornament. He doesn't see it as work that makes a product, or he doesn't see it as a work that is done, ergon, and then a work that is added onto, parergon. He sees it as a work that is overworked. It spills over. It's a hypergon. I would call it a hypergon, from hypergon. It's an overworking, and that work doesn't stop with the appearance. It actually works through the appearance. So we get this very particular relationship between work and appearance. It's not like, oh, when something appears, the work stops. It's like the work goes on, and of course we will see this how this actually functions with the three graces. But there is something going on here. It is a form of spilling over. It's like work itself spills over, and while it spills over, it transfigures and becomes an appearance. So this transformation, this turn, this tropos of stance, of being a thing that is structured and it's doing its work, is transformed into an appearance. And that's not this opposition, but that's actually a transformation. Right, so it's not two, but it's one, or it's one thing that is doing two things, or it's one figure that is doing two things. How does this overworking of Hephaestus, how does that actually function in the structure of the three graces or in the gift cycle? I think it's really about this how work and shining, sort of these two poles of Hephaestus and Aglaia, how these actually function in that system. And being married to Aglaia, I mean, there's so many issues between Hephaestus and Aglaia. We just have to investigate that more clearly. But I think first we need to get like a proper understanding of how that can work. And here there's the structure of the gift cycle of Aglaia giving, Ephrosyne receiving, and Thalia returning or thanking. And that can be a structure of goods, it can be a structure of feelings, it can be a mixture of goods and feelings that's been developed over the years. It's a very aesthetic structure. I think what in terms of shining and work, I think Aglaia is who shines, right? Her name actually means either splendor or shining. It's quite literally shining. Ephrosyne, well-spirited. Ephrosyne means well-spirited. She's generally depicted as drinking. There are not a lot of images of Ephrosyne, but she's the one who takes in. There's a sort of darkening of that shining, but that's and that darkening is like it's processing. It's how the shining actually works. So this is a working, and with Thalia, that working actually becomes a transformation again, a form of appearing. So it's like that how that working shines, or how that process actually becomes an appearance. With Ephrosyne, it's like almost a digesting. We have a beautiful word in Dutch for it, verwerken. It means like you're working through. She's working through, or she's transforming. Of course, this transformation becomes only visible with Thalia, but it is a work in progress. Right, it's a form of digestion or incorporation. It's really this absorptive mimesis I've been speaking about. So they're shining, and this is almost like the other side. And this is a shining again, but not a shining of a thing or an object or a figure, but it's much more that work as an event that shines. Thalia is often related to progress or growth. Flourishing, so flowering, right? That's clearly that it's a sense of transformation, but also that of transfiguration. Now, how do I see Hephaestus as a figure? Is he just like dangling from Aglaia as a sort of separate thing, or is he like outside of this image? Now, I've been trying very hard to actually involve him in this structure, and this is what I came up with, a fourfold, but a gift structure as a fourfold. Now, there's a reason why Greek mythology generally thinks in threes, especially when it comes to processes. The moire, the fates, are always three. The horai, the seasons, they only had 3 seasons. So there's generally triads of maidens, not always maidens, of 3 female figures that make a single structure of a very covert operations, very covert in the sense that, the gift cycle, they're always like next to Venus, and the horai are always like behind. So they're making things work, but they're not like specifically in the foreground. So I'm placing Hephaestus, and of course Hephaestus is the figure who makes shining things. So let's see. She's the figure who shines. This is how the shining works. This is about how work itself shines, and this is a making shining things. So this would be a sort of new type of cycle, but it could also be an ontological system. And of course, I mentioned the word fourfold. So there's two axes. Heidegger doesn't work with axes. He uses quadrants: earth, gods, mortals, and sky, which are much more about presence and absence. This case is not so much about absence, because the truth is, of course, that on the technological axis of work, which you would normally say, well, he's in a fort in a cave, and she's like imbibing or incorporating or taking in. Yes, sure, these are darkening, but they have a very specific function in making visible on the pheno axis. So I'm having two axes here. A techno axis of work and a pheno axis of appearance. And I'm much more interested in not an opposition of work and Beiwerk, but as a sort of looping of this this pheno and techno, of this appearing and working. Now, Hephaestus is of course close to the figure of Pistias that we met in the discussion of jumping in Eurythmia, and Socrates asking Pistias about how to make a thorax rhythmic, that means well proportioned, for an ill proportioned arrhythmia, for an ill proportioned figure, and that would be through a loose fit. Now, this structure tells us a lot. You could also see it as an object and event, or a space and time structure. So this would be the object that shines. This is the object that processes. This is the process that shines. So this is the shining axis. And this is the process that makes objects. So it's also a product process, or a being becoming, or an object event fourfold. And when it is a fourfold, it's not just like it's living on the periphery. It's actually everywhere within this circle. For this diagram, so each thing would be able to take a position in here, and that structure would sort of enable all kinds of asymmetries and flippings from work towards shining, and shining towards work, and as a constant flipping. I think that's the most important thing to say about this, that all these positions are unstable in a way, and that they're always part of a larger system. So it's about work that can appear, and it's about how appearances work, right? So there's no clear separation of one or the other. Now I've developed a term for this in the Grace and Gravity book. It's not a discussion I want to make too long over here, but I call it phenotechnology. And phenotechnology is a strange term, and that's for sure. But it is different than phenomenology, and it's different than let's say all types of realism, because it doesn't want to incorporate the phenomenal. Now, the problem of the phenomenal is that appearances are in our minds. So there's consciousness is not there, it's always here. So things, as Heidegger says, things are for themselves and show themselves for us. That means you are here. So again, the Wesentliche, the essential, is on the side of being here, right? And standing by yourself. And then the appearing happens over there. Now the problem of that is, and it's really a horrible problem, is that that can never, ever, never explain how things appear, right? Because everything that appears, if it's the color red, or the taste of salt, or the smell of smoke, or the hearing of a car driving by, or whatever, all these experiences that we know through phenomenology, these are always on the side of the subject. So it's in that sense, it's an idealism totally separated from realism. So there's things that are real cannot have no influence at all over how they appear, because how they appear happens on this side. This is a really horrible problem. And I think what shining means, and that's scary, but shining means that things can actually claim that access to a world of consciousness. Now, this sounds like panpsychism. That's not really the same. Panpsychism is almost like cosmic consciousness, like it's consciousness everywhere, and we sort of float and act within that consciousness with a sort of second consciousness. That's not what it is. It's really a realist notion in the sense that, yes, objects do shine. There's this je ne sais quoi, there's this blur. And I think this blur is different than what we would call an image. Images are in our minds, but an appearance can still be blurred. Can be millions of images overlapping with each other and intersecting with each other and penetrating each other and making each other blurred. So it's a sense that it's not, there's a too much, and that's obviously what Hephaestus is doing. There's a too much to things. There's an abundance, and that's of course what gives. But what gives is not given yet. So it's not a relational theory. Doesn't say, okay, these objects that shine are already in a state of being related, because these relations are what you take out, what you imbibe, right? According to Aphrodite, what you drink or what you absorb. But these are only images. These are only like small parts. So there's a difference between, let's say, that blur or that spilling over of things, that spilling over, and the images in our minds, which are much more in focus and sharp. So it's not a panpsychism, but it does attribute a level of consciousness, a sort of general state of consciousness to things, which of course is unprovable because we can't interview them or anything. We can dissect them and look at their consciousness, but it does, in that sense, it does solve this unbearable problem that things are over there and the images of them or the experiences of them are over here, which I think in any theory, if it's either coming from an idealist side or from a materialist or realist side, it's impossible to solve, especially from a materialist side. I mean, this is a materialist side. What would it say about red? Okay, there's an object there, and then there's sunlight that falls on it, and then that sunlight is broken because it's white, and then through the surface of that thing, only a specific electromagnetic frequency emanates from the object, and that frequency, what is it, around 7,000 angstrom, what is it, 700 nanometers, and that hits our eyes, and you get a whole set of potassium and sodium ions, and it hits your visual cortex somewhere in the V4 area, and at what point does it turn red? Nowhere. It's just one thing hammering on another thing. It's just one. It's very Democritian, you know. There's Democritus, one of the very first materialists. You know, this idea of atoms like hitting each other, and of course with Epicurus and Lucretius, this becomes a swerve. But at no point, it can explain where red emerges, and it can only say, yeah, there's an emergence of red, but cannot say anything about the quality of red, and that's unbearable, I think. So let's attribute some of that consciousness to things, and let's call that shining. And I think that's the realm That's the realm where Hephaestus works in. Now, this is a small step, though it looks like a large step, because Hephaestus never built a labyrinth. But Hephaestus, there's Greece, there's Lemnos, and there's Crete, right? Crete at the south, Lemnos in the west, close to Turkey. There's Hephaestus. There's no cult of Hephaestus on Crete. There is on Lemnos. But he is known, and there's even text in Linear B, in Mycenaean Greek, that use the name Hephaestus. So he's very, very old as a figure, not always as a god. And that's the same with Daedalus. And Daedalus is a figure from Crete, obviously, because of the labyrinth and with the Minotaur. The Minotaur is actually much later. So the labyrinth as a structure is known throughout many, many different cultures and mythologies, all the way to at least 40,000 BC. So it's extremely old. So it's no surprise that at a certain point it emerges in the Greek world, and it emerges via Daedalus and via Crete. But they are very close, if not overlapping. The name Daedalus is mentioned only once in Homer, and actually in a way that he suggests that Hephaestus is doing exactly the same as Daedalus is doing on Crete. He's actually organizing a dance, a spiraling dance, a choros, and that dance is a copy of the dance that is organized by Daedalus on Crete. And what is this dance? It's the labyrinth. The labyrinth actually not a building. It's supposedly it's derived from the caves of Gortina, which is actually quite a good idea, but it's never proven. Because obviously, if you see you can make a plan of a cave, but there are drawings or diagrams of the interior of a cave. Its whole structure doesn't look at all like a labyrinth. Because a labyrinth, this one is extremely stylized, and this is a figure we see very often, all over the world. But what's interesting is that both Daedalus and Hephaestus are these sort of craftsmen as well as craftymen, forgers as well as forgerers, crooked, in the sense that what they make has this idea of cunning, and the word cunning in Homer is used very often, and it's used by the word Daedala, or Daedaleon, or Daedalus, or whatever. So you get many different versions of that term. No, there's a difference, is that Daedalus is not a god and Hephaestus is, which is quite an exception, because there's not that many smiths that make it to a god. So Daedalus, this maker, has a very high status, but he doesn't have the divine status that Hephaestus has. They both make things that stop events as well as initiate events or make them move. In scholarly texts, they call this binders as well as looseners, or loosers even, in the sense that, of course, in the question of Daedalus, the stopping is, of course, the prison of the labyrinth, and the moving is for instance, the making of the wings for his son Icarus. And with Hephaestus, the stopping could be, the shield of Achilles would be a stopper, but also the web that ensnares his wife, Aglaia, when she's making love with the god of war Ares. So that would be a stopping, and of course the movers that he makes are the automatons. So that they both have sort of these poles of artifice, right? So the artifice can go in the direction of making things stop as well as making things move. So there's many overlaps between Daedalus and Hephaestus. Sometimes it's said that Daedalus or Daedali is an epithet of Hephaestus, but they're actually separate figures. No, the labyrinth. I mean, you could do 20 lectures just about the labyrinth, but the labyrinth in itself is, you can hardly call it a prison. I think the first thing we should say is that the Minotaur is actually a much later invention, probably a Greek invention from 500 BC, and the labyrinth on Crete we already see mentioned in 1500 BC. So there's quite a discrepancy between all these understandings of what labyrinths are. But Karenyi, as I'm showing a part of his text from this book called Karenyi, Labyrinth Studien. There are many fantastic books on Daedalus, and I have one here, Françoise Fantisi Ducroux, Daedalus. It's a beautiful book, a lot of writing about Hephaestus as well as Daedalus. And then I have the Sarah Morris's book on Daedalus, very interesting. Anyway, Karenyi discusses the labyrinth on many different levels, on the level of dance, for instance, but also on ornament. And he compares the ornament to the spiraling of the meander as a labyrinthic figure. Now, I already said that, yes, the labyrinth could be derived from the caves of Cortina, but it's never built. It's never described as something that's built, only later. It's actually a dance. So it's dance as well as ornament, and that's how it's often described as a spiraling dance. And spiraling dances are well known throughout many different cultures, and these spiraling dances often go inward and then outward, and or they're like versions of round dances, and the round dance contracting and expanding, but also spiraling. Sometimes there's a female figure or a girl in the middle, and there's even cultures where the girl is sacrificed and cast in a well when we come to the middle. That's not what happens in the labyrinth, though. Let's not forget that the Minotaur actually devours 7 young men and 7 young women. So that's important. What is exactly this Minotaur? So it's not a really Cretan. We shouldn't go in all the sort of the details in the discussions in philology and art history and archaeology. These are very, very important, but that's not what I want to talk about. I'm much more interested in the fact that the labyrinth is not so much a building. I mean, how would it be a building? How dumb would the Minotaur be to not get out of a labyrinth, especially this one that we call this a unicursal labyrinth. It's not a maze. It's just the one line that's been rolled up and folded, but you just walk out. So it's nothing like architecture. It's not like you have a room with a heavy door and the key is thrown away, and you're locked up. The Minotaur is in the middle, especially in the later versions. The Minotaur is in the middle, but this route towards the middle is really, Ferreira would call it an anamorphosis of the threshold. That's a beautiful way of saying it. It's almost like a warping of standstill. So you have a figure of standstill, and you don't have a corridor to that point, but you actually twist and turn the corridor around that point. So the corridor actually goes nowhere, right? So the corridor normally goes from A to B, but this corridor actually goes from A to A. It's like the stories of Borges. The best labyrinth is in the middle of the desert. You can, or the middle of the universe, according to Pascal. Right? That's what Borges always quotes. He's like, the middle is everywhere and the periphery is nowhere. So when the middle is everywhere, you cannot walk, right? Because every movement is like you're on the same spot. So that's what a labyrinth is. It's really a transformation of space. So in that sense, it's really a form of the gap. And what is this figure in the middle? It is his name is actually Asterion or Asterios, and it means star. And now you're getting to something, because a star shines, and we have to understand what this is. Now, according to Plutarch, when Theseus has slain the Minotaur, finally, because Theseus from Athens, and he goes home to Athens and he celebrates. He dances the so-called crane dance, or the crane dance with a rope. And Plutarch says that is actually a copy of the labyrinth dance, or of the labyrinth. So that the crane dance is the Geranos, and he dances that with 7 young men and 7 young women. Is a copy of that, what happened on Crete. Now, what is that exactly? Is that actually, what does that rope mean? What do all these involutions and evolutions mean, as Plutarch calls them, all these windings? And what is this horned figure in the middle? Now, we know horned figures. We know horned figures, horned gods even. In southern France, there's a cave. There's a cave again. In southern France, there's a cave called Trois Frères. And very, very deep in the cave, there's an image of a man walking with horns, with antlers. And we know this from shamanism. They would have ceremonies, very long ceremonies, because they're about ecstasy and epiphanies, where there's a lot of dancing and a lot of percussion and a lot of singing in the caves at that time, right? So in a closed space, to the point of transfiguration. To the point of transfiguration. And we know this spiraling figures from the dervishes, which do it for exactly the same reason, right? So there's this rotational in and out, so you don't know where space is anymore, so you're becoming groundless. So the standing becomes, through dancing, becomes groundless, till you reach a moment of epiphany or ecstasy or transfiguration. So the Minotaur is not so much a creature as well as a derivation of a man wearing headgear. So that would be the shaman. I think the Greeks, I'm not the first one who says this actually, the Greeks invented the Minotaur as an understanding of what actually happened in these crane dances or rope dances, where you would have a rope spiraling, the rope, the string, the thread of Ariadne, obviously. But there's a rope of dying and being reborn, right? So it's much more complicated than a cycle. It's much more complicated. It's really going in, and while you go in, you lose yourself, and you lose the notion of space and where you are, and that's where you radiate, and then you return to yourself, transformed, obviously, not the same. Now the weird thing is that these horned figures, these are not by accident radiating from the head. This is the most famous example. The horns of Moses, same type of epiphany, and in the Hebrew Bible, it says Qaran, and that has two meanings. Qaran has two meanings. One is ray coming from his head. It says in Exodus 34 in the Bible. And the Jerome Bible actually translated it as rays, but the older Wycliffe Bible translates it as horns, because Quran has a double meaning, horn and ray. And the strange thing is, we see the same with Apollo. With the radiant head, we get to Apollo, the radiant head, as well as the arrows, and in different languages, the word for ray is also the word for arrow. Strala. I think it's not just Dutch. Straal. It actually means, in all the languages, it means ray or sun ray, as well as arrow. So the halo that we know from Apollo, the spiked halo, is quite literally the horns on the head of the Minotaur. So they're not exactly the same, obviously, but they have the same background, and certainly the same conceptual structure. Now, what does this mean? That both are figures of transfiguration. So we can actually say that that this tropos I was speaking about of stands into appearance. That appearance is actually that of the radiating of the transfiguration. So we get stages in that figure. We get like a stage towards prefiguration, then the figure as a whole, and then at the end a transfiguration. So we get like different aspects to what a figure is. Now, this is almost literally a standing figure with a radiating head, the column, and actually the swelling of that column, which we call entasis, and its transformation at the head. The transformation at the head through the acanthus leaves curling. Of course, this is a weakening, right? This is important to understand, is that this hypergon, this overwork, this work spilling over, is not just pure strength. It's a strength through weakening. And a weakening through stands, obviously, but so there's a looping. So it's not just a reversal, but it's not like, okay, we have the ergon first and then the parergon. It's really this looping of both poles, but the weakening itself plays a very important role. And I just want to sort of concentrate on that aspect for a bit. So we got this Corinthian column. Weakening, and you see the rippling at the pedestal. We call it the pedestal, but it's actually a form of rippling. Then we get the swelling of the shaft, and then we get this sort of this folding and bending. So these are all like, it's much more limited than what you would see in the Gothic, where you get like multiple ribs and they bend in all directions and they interweave with each other, which is much more a textile notion. I mean, Zemper wouldn't like me for it, for saying this, but the textile sort of taken over the whole structure. He hated the Gothic, but I think in that sense, this is almost a Gothic interpretation of a classical column. But there's this figure, and I'm seeing arrows again. I can't get these out of my head. I'm seeing arrows again, so I'm seeing a figure. A pilloried figure, as a public humiliation, St Sebastian, shot through with arrows, and these arrows are pointing inward, but they're actually pointing outward as a sense of a halo for the whole body. A halo for the whole body is not just the head, which you call a halo. A halo for the whole body we call a mandorla, which is also that idea of the mandala. But it's this radiating outwards, this moving sideways of a thing that stands. So that's what we're seeing. This pain, this suffering and weakening, transforming into an appearance, and that will become our main topic. We've shown this before. Such a beautiful image. Now the caryatids, the women of Caria, load bearing, a part of the temple of Erechtheion. There are 6 figures. We can discuss it as the vertical, again as a contrapposto, as a vertical, as a bearing, and then that sideways moving of the breasts and the knees and the arms, which we can't see now, and especially the eyes. So this thing is like looking horizontally out, a vertical thing that is looking horizontally out. What an idea of shining that is. And so that there's this transformation here of pain, because these are women that are pilloried. That's how it's described by George Hersey, and I think he's correct. These women are like, it's a punishment. It's an image of punishment. It's these women are tied up to the column. We know pillorying in many different versions, and he basically, George Hersey says, goes from pillory and crucifixion. Crucifixion as a form of pillorying, and what you see here is this transformation of bearing pain into a transformation, a transfiguration into ease. So that the heaviness, this is pure gravity becoming grace, and pure ergon becoming hypergon, moving outward, but basically through a transformation of pain and punishment. And that's why I want to discuss this figure. There's no way you cannot discuss the figure of Christianity, because it's related in many ways to grace. But it's a hanging figure. It's a hanging figure. It's the ornament of the religion. It is. For an architect, look at these two figures. It's just like that post and beam, and then the hanging from it. That's pure Winkelmann almost. It's pure Winkelmann. This is like the 2 chapters, the 2 divisions, the 2 parts of Winkelmann's book. It's not a bewegtes Beiwerk, obviously, because it's not moving anymore. But there's this. It's a very powerful image of hanging, and I'm asking myself, how does that relate to the grace machine, and how does it relate to that image that we see on the left? Where we see a transformation of gravity into grace. So the question is, when the figures on the left are making this loop from heaviness and gravity towards grace, and from grace to gravity, is that figure on the right actually capable of that looping? Now, generally this figure is called the figura crucis, the crossed figure, and of course the crossed figure makes us think about our crossed figure, the chiastic structure, the contrapposto. There's a bit of wood involved, but of course that's an internal crossing. It's an asymmetrical crossing. It's chiastic, so it is standing by itself, almost. It's standing by itself. but it's not like the whole body is involved in the standing. It's again having this sideways movement of the knees and the arms and the neck and the heel. So there's this internal movement and internal crossing. So the activity and the passivity of standing and the activity of moving are like folding over each other. So that we get this active standing, right? Where action and passion are starting to overlap with each other. Well, obviously on the right, we see a separation of it's a pure figure of passion, of undergoing, of being weight, of hanging, and the big question is. How does that figure on the right, Christ, and how does that whole realm of the Christian religion claim grace? Now, if we of course they did not invent grace. They got it from the Greeks, so to speak. But almost all religions have a relationship with grace. Hinduism has a relationship with grace that's very clear, and just to say that the Old Testament is often called the law, the law as the law of works, and the New Testament the law of grace, and the Old Testament being a structure of obedience and works, in the sense that when you follow all the rules, you get a seat in paradise. It's a moment of salvation. The New Testament says something else. It says, it's not a way of earning, but it is a form of grace that's either received. It's always received, but it's can be resisted or not, which is a big issue in Christian theology. We know that Saint Paul, actually lived in southern Turkey, in Tarsus, and he's Jewish, but the Jews in southern Turkey spoke Greek, and that Greek language was deeply influenced by Hellenic Greece, and Hellenic Greece is already a transformation, a further transformation of the gift cycle and grace. There's actually quite a lot of books that have been lost about grace and gift exchange. Seneca, the Roman theoretician, actually refers to these books, but they don't exist anymore. Cleanthes, Chrysippus, people like that, who actually wrote about the gift cycle and the gift structure. But that in Greek Stoicism, Hellenic Stoicism, which was a strong influence on Roman Stoicism, had already a pretty socialized view of the gift cycle and this whole exchange of generosity and thanking and giving and wealth, which often derived from Aristotle. And so Paul knew a lot about charis. It was actually quite a standard word at that time, and he brought that in as the 13th apostle. He brought that in Christianity. Let's not forget that almost half of the books of the New Testament are written by Paul. And he's very eloquent on this relationship between grace and works. And it's not like there's an opposition. It's not like, like work and play, obviously. you have to find grace, almost like free will, as a form of free will, to actually follow what grace from above tells you to do. So it's both immanent as well as transcendent. There's this double position. So Paul, I'm not discussing Paul here, I mean, that would be another bunch of lectures, but there's clearly an idea of how one works with the other. And my question is really how that hanging figure, my question now is how that figure on the right is not chiastic yet, while the figure on the left is chiastic. Now the figure on the left looks relaxed and at ease, as we say from grace, and that figure on the right obviously not. That goes through a deep humiliation of public pillorying and crucifixion. But there is a structure that gives us the poles of the aspects of the chiastic. So if we actually see the crossing out, the cross is a crossing out, which is now still external, almost like an exoskeleton, so that the post and beam are like external to that hanging figure. If we can sort of reverse that relationship, then we can say, well, there's a rightful claim of Christianity on the grace machine, on the whole structure of grace. Now, obviously, if the grace machine exists, and many religions make use of the idea of grace, then it must be related to what the grace machine tells us to do. Now, one of my arguments is that this occurs not in a single figure. Now, this is important because we often describe the figure both as a jump, as an arc, and as that apex, that thing at the apex that is structured through the vertical axis between thing and the field, foot space and hand space. But there's always this arc, and that can be the arc of metaphor, which combines two things into one, or it can be an extremely long arc, a temporal arc that we see discussed by Auerbach when he discusses Christian realism, that of the promise, and almost like as the first coming and the second coming of Christ. So there can be an extremely long arc. In this case, I think we can just see that single figure. Actually, it's a quite small arc between, let's say, the Via Dolorosa, the way of pain. That's what it means, the Via Dolorosa, the way of pain, and the Calvary, the actual crucifixion. So if you actually, they're both paintings by El Greco, by the way. If we actually look at this as a model, we see Christ first bearing the weight of the cross, and then on the right we see Christ as the weight on the cross. So we see him carrying his own hanging, so to speak, if we read it as one figure. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, there is a figura crucis, but it's the figura crucis, not just that figure hanging from the cross. It's actually both. It's both the carrying as well as the bearing. So the figure, again, is always double, but it can be a figure that sort of splits itself in time and brings two things together. Let's compare this to Oscar Wilde, who's much closer to the Doryphoros, because he's not even a aestheticist. He's a decadent author at the fin de siècle. Goes through the most horrible humiliation. And of course, that's well known. Is being tried and prisoned. And there we go to De Profundis, the long letter he writes to his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, from his prison in Reading jail. And it's a beautiful piece of writing. and he is going through all this pain, and it's almost like he starts as Doryphorus and ends up as Christ. It's a route that we know from saints. It's a route that goes through humiliation and pain and the worst experiences. And what's so interesting about him is that he writes about reason doesn't help me. It tells me that the laws under which I'm convicted are wrong and unjust laws, and the system under which I've suffered a wrong and unjust system. But somehow I have the gut to make both of these things just and right to me. And he says something else over here. When I think about religion at all, I feel as if I would like to found an order of those who cannot believe, a confraternity of the faithless, one might call it, where on an altar where no taper burned, a priest in which the heart piece had no dwelling might celebrate with unblessed bread and a chalice empty of wine. So, a confraternity of the faithless. That's a fantastic idea. Because what he says here is that this finding of the figure of grace, this finding of grace, this looping, and let's not forget this double figure exists in Oscar Wilde as well. We get that Oscar Wilde being famous for his plays and being celebrated author, and then his fall, and then his complete humiliation in Paris, where he's living in a hotel he cannot pay for, and he's dying in the gutters. The worst possible death for somebody like that. And so he trying to find this loop, this figure of grace, which you all try to find in some way, either small or large, or about your whole life. And this is again about somebody trying to grab his whole life into one figure like Christ by this not believing. It's not a question of belief. This whole idea of grace is not a question of belief. I think that from a theological point of view, this is a watershed. He says basically you can have faith, but no belief. Now he calls it a confraternity of the faithless, but it's quite clear that he has a sense of faith in what he does himself and how he goes beyond himself and goes back to himself. So there's a transfiguration, but there's also a going back. So the laws that are unjust and wrong, I have to make just and right to me, just and right. That's the moral order, the just and right of Kant, right? That's what Schiller was so interested in. Is how can grace actually find this moral order? It's the same for St. Paul. It's how can you have free will and at the same time morally follow, right? So that's what Oscar Wilde is doing here. It's really quite a stunning feat and quite shocking. And it's about how you make something that is crooked straight, and of course how you make something straight that is crooked. Make something crooked that is straight. So we're finding a loop of one and the other. I think that's a sort of sure, grace is something that transcends gravity, but it's also something and conquers gravity, obviously, not just hanging from it, also ascending. That would be the other double figure, the hanging and the ascending. Would be a beautiful idea as well. Now, I just want to take a bit of time to extend this notion of Christianity, because they have this beautiful word for this this transfiguring, this becoming pure ornament, which is sweetness. Can you believe it? It says that the sweet nails of passion, the sweet nails of passion. The word sweetness. We already find it in Paul's epistles, but we find it more and more in Saint Augustine of Hippo, in the City of God, and his Confessions, where he talks about suavitas very, very often. And suavitas means is literally the root of sweetness. And what a beautiful word. And of course, it is Saint Paul. The weakening that makes me strong. So that transformation, that transfiguration is that what makes you sweet. And I would like to look at a few saints, Saint Lidwine and Saint Angela. What is the idea of a saint? And of course, saints are extreme in their quest for figuration, or the quest for the finding of grace. And here it's described, and this is actually a book written by Huysmans, the famous fin de siècle author of Against Nature, à Rebours. And so at the end, after his conversion to Catholicism, he writes a book about Saint Lidwine of Schiedam. It's actually one of the few saints that the Dutch have. And thank goodness we have Huysmans to write about her. There's a whole story about Saint Lidwine. She was very young. She fell on the ice, is wounded, and the wounds get worse and worse, and she gets very ill. And but this illness, of course, brings her to sainthood. And what is the idea of a saint? Is to take who nail themselves to the empty place on the cross. And there's two forms of emptiness here. One is that the cross is now vacant. And in an imitation of Christ, they call it imitatio Christi, they place themselves, what's the idea of a saint imitating Christ, placing yourself in the empty place on the cross. What an idea. Through going through emptiness, which Paul already mentioned as kenosis, and becomes very important in Christianity and in theology. You see it at St. John of the Cross. He goes through the dark night. You see it in Simone Weil, talking about the void of decreation. So first you get like the law of gravity. Then you enter a void. You detach yourself from natural law. You detach yourself in a void, bring yourself into a void, this emptiness. And that decreation actually allows you to be recreated, which is a movement of grace. And again, then being in order with gravity. So first it's a move against gravity, and then it flips through that, going through the void. In parallel or with gravity. It's quite overwhelming when you read it, because there's no holding back here. By constant miracle, he made of these wounds veritable censers of perfume. It's the last sentence of Saint Lidwine going through her transfiguration. The plasters which that is the family, the family of Lidwine taking care of her, the plasters which they took off, teeming with vermin, sweetly scented the air. All that came from her had a delicate aroma, and he wished that from her body there should always emanate an exquisite atmosphere of shells and spices of the East, a fragrance at once keen and sweet, something like the smoke of cinnamon and spices. What a fabulous description. So this is the same decadent Huysmans, but now writing from a Christian point of view. So all this is not against nature, but it's now with nature. Of course, it's the supernatural emanating through nature. And then she ends 20 pages later. So quite a horrible description. Her stomach finally burst like a ripe fruit, and they had to apply a woolen cushion to press back her entrails and prevent them from leaving the body. Soon, when they wished to move her to change the sheets of her bed, they had to bind her members firmly with napkins and cloths, for otherwise her body would have fallen to pieces and come away in the hands of those who attended her. So this is the imitation of Christ, a saintly dream. They call this dolorism. Huysmans was called by Léon Blois, his friend at the time, a dolorist. But it is as they completely experience the ornament and the pure weakness of ornament, and through pain, obviously, but not as pain, but as something that's transfigured into beauty and sweetness. Just such a beautiful term. There's many more examples. On the right, we see the official term in the Confessions by Saint Augustine. It's actually described as Dulcedo Dei, my sweet Lord, my sweetness. Now, this is an expression of love. Lovers call each other honey and sugar. Well, that's Old English, probably. Sugar and sweetie. I'm in Atlanta here, and I hear that word like 5 times a day. Hi, sweetie. So that's a term of such affection. Is just an experience of ornament, and look here. After this, we washed the feet of the poor women in the hands of the men, but especially those of a leper, which were all putrefied and spoiled and full of corruption. Afterwards, we did drink the water wherewith we washed him, and that drink was so sweet unto us that we tasted of its sweetness all the way as we returned until we arrived at this place. So the saint is washing the lepers, and she drinks the water. It's the most sweet. So, and this we have to take this extremely serious, and not in a pathological sense. It's not a question of belief, I believe, nor of psychology. It's an extreme form of yoga. That's how I see it. It's postural in the sense that it goes through a set of sensations which are extreme. Now, yoga, I'm using the word here, yoga, that's the yoke. It's the yoke where Christ hangs from. Yoga, not sure if you're aware, but yoga is not a fitness industry at all. Yoga is it's 84 asanas, postures, and these postures can be very orthographic, very extreme and architectural, to go through pain. So we get this transformation that we know from athletes as well, to go through pain and then transfigure into a winner or not. It's the same type of exercise. So yes, it's extreme, but it is a searching for this looping of difficulty and undergoing and bearing as a sense of gravity, and by weakening yourself to the extreme to find sweetness. Now, the most beautiful text, I think, on this type of sweetness is written by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Let me just look at a few words. So this is about, he has a few chapters on saints and sainthood, and it's very well described. To get you get all these terms of weakening, and they're very liquid terms of weakening. Let me see. To get to it, a critical point must usually be passed, a corner turned within one. Something must give way, so that's as we know, was Michel Serres' definition of grace. You stand and you give way, right? So there's an instability. There's this gap. There's the opening up, giving way, yielding, making way. This entering of the gap. So you give way. A native hardness must break down and liquefy. So again, hardness, ergon, must break down and liquefy. Again, special grace, gift of tears, another liquid association. Melting moods, as a word he uses very often, have possessed what the church traditionally refers as a special grace, the so-called gift of tears, which are always angels that have the gift of tears, or saints, but especially angels. Angels always crying, not just at the tombs of the dead, but also always shedding tears over pain. In these persons, the melting mood seems to have held almost uninterrupted control. And here there's more, where he goes about sweet calmness, sweet light, sweetness. He's constantly quoting from people who described that transfiguration. And I think we really have to try very hard to understand it within the gift structure. And I know it's quite a route to go from ornament and columns with acanthus leaves, weakening, and through the notion of pain and suffering and bearing and bringing gravity back in, the moving sideways and finding beauty and sweetness. But I think that this follows exactly the structure of grace as something that's super abundant. Of course, the idea is not that everybody does such a thing. Of course, it basically means that you can only find strength through weakness, and there's a route through weakness. And I think in that sense, the model of Christ, of that post and being with the serpentine figure on it, serpentine figure, Francis Bacon calls it, I think, a worm, as a start for that structure, to say, okay, there's strength and there's weakness, and there are now an extreme poles, and you have to find how to look them. And that's exactly what it's the caryatids from Eric Theon do, but it's also exactly what Oscar Wilde did. And that's where I want to end this lecture. Thank you very much.